Welcome to Closing the Growth Gap for June 11, 2024. I'm Ben Scanlon, co-founder of Mosaic Growth Solutions, and Closing the Growth Gap is where I share my insights on the most interesting articles related to growth and marketing based on my experience assessing hundreds of B2B SaaS companies and helping drive millions in growth. We have a number of great topics today. First up, Dan Cremons says to PE investors, you need to take a look at the organization when you're putting together your investment thesis. It's one thing to find a huge opportunity for growth, but it's another thing to actually get there, and that happens by looking at the organization. Two, I talk about retiring the term brand marketing because it's a terrible term. It downplays the importance of brand, and it does not help with your performance. And three, Jason Lemkin talks about how painful it is for companies to switch, and I talk about the need to make it as easy as possible to help them switch. All right, let's dive in. All right, you're a PE investor. You think you found a great firm to invest in. You think the investment thesis is very, very strong. And so you're ready to get going. But you may be forgetting about a critical component related to growth, which is the organization. And that's what Dan Cremons talks about here. He says the importance of organizational due diligence is growing in PE. And I'm so glad that it is. We've worked with many different PE firms, many different PE-backed companies. And we see this, like whether it's we come in after due diligence or during due diligence, there's just not enough time focused on some of these aspects that he lays out here. And so I'm glad that he addressed this. And the first thing he says is the leadership. You want to understand the leader's strengths, their weaknesses, where you need to back or redeploy the leader or maybe replace that leader, and how healthy and performant the executive leadership team is. But there's a couple of other things here that I think are really important in terms of understanding the leadership is, has the leader articulated their growth vision very, very clearly? And are people inspired by that growth vision? Do they understand it, and are they rallying around that idea? Without that growth vision, it becomes very, very hard to grow. And then finally, you need to make sure that growth vision is aligned with your investment thesis. You don't want to be battling with the founder or CEO throughout your investment period in terms of the right way to grow or what's the opportunity to grow. And so, yes, what Dan says here is true, but I'd also include that you have a clear understanding of how that leader is seeing growth happen, and did they articulate it, and did they get people inspired by that within the organization? Second, he talks about talent, and so you want to understand how talented the team is. I will say, working with many different PE firms and looking at the investment decks, almost always they've looked at leadership and talent. And so this isn't something that I feel that's being neglected. It does happen. I mean, maybe there's a better approach to it, but it is being addressed. But this third point is something that I do not see addressed often enough, and is a very important component of growth, which is culture. You want to understand what defines a culture today, the strengths and risks, how to evolve, how change ready, how growth ready. And this is so important. It's important that that vision was articulated and that people are rallying behind it. It's important that you have a talented team, but it's also important that there's a growth culture in place. Not everything is going to be smooth sailing. Not every test is going to be a win. You need to make sure that people are supported in doing their best innovative work, that it's a test and learn environment, that people are enabled to move quickly. This culture, this growth culture, is just absolutely critical in terms of driving growth. And we saw, as I mentioned, we've worked with many different PE firms. And so we'd come in after the PE firm, they had their investment thesis, this is how we're going to grow. But we would work with companies to say, this is how you're going to do it. This is the approach you need to take. These are the tactics and strategies you need to put in place. And sometimes it would work so well, the company would we'd work with them, they'd achieve transformational growth. But sometimes it was a struggle. And we really took the time to think about, why is this? And this is why. It's if the culture wasn't in place and that growth vision not articulated, transformational growth was very hard to achieve. So this must be addressed. So we updated our methodology and created something called the Growth X Factor, which looks at some of these elements to make sure there's a culture of growth, clearly articulated vision, there's alignment around that vision, because these are just the core components for driving growth. And then finally, Dan mentions capabilities. So you have a vision, you have an inspired team, strong talent on the team, a growth culture, but are they actually able to drive that growth? Are they capable of driving that growth? And so this is another important factor to assess when you're deciding whether to make an investment or not. So a lot of PE folks spend a lot of time in the numbers, probably because a lot of them are nerds. I mean, I'm a nerd. I love numbers, so I get it. Like that's where what resonates with me. But you need to make sure, even if the numbers look good, that the culture and the leadership in the organization can actually make that growth happen. All right, next up, a post from me. So you know it's brilliant. Just kidding. But what I talk about here, it's time to retire these marketing terms. I start this post off by talking about demand generation. And there's quite a few posts going on out there, being written out there and getting a lot of engagement around how demand generation is a great term. And I've been writing and talking about this for years. In fact, I remember we gave a presentation to the portfolio companies of a certain PE company about marketing and how to do marketing. And I actually brought this term up back in 2018 and said, hey, demand generation is a misnomer. You can't actually create demand. If people don't have a need and recognize that need, no amount of marketing is actually going to create demand for them. So demand generation isn't a great term. And it was a little contentious. Even back then, it's still a little contentious. But I think it's important to talk about the terminology. And my next thing is brand marketing. And I don't like the term brand marketing. And why is this? Because brand is so much more than a certain part of marketing. Brand is all of your customer interactions. Brand is in everything. And so to restrict it to just a certain type of marketing is a mistake. The other thing I don't like about brand marketing is often positions against performance marketing. But brand marketing is an absolutely critical component of driving growth. It drives performance. And so when you have this juxtaposition of brand versus performance, it makes brand marketing like it's not going to drive performance. And so you go to the CEO and say, hey, do you want brand or performance? They're going to say, well, I want performance. Even though brand awareness is a critical component of that performance. And so I don't like it from that perspective either. It diminishes the importance of brand throughout the entire organization. It makes it look like brand awareness, developing your brand, isn't related to performance. And so, of course, marketers all the time complain. They're like, hey, no one wants to invest in brand marketing. Well, because you're calling it brand marketing. You go to the CEO and say, hey, I want to make people aware of my brand. That's not an end goal. Just making people aware of your brand is not the objective here. So it's really hard to get people to sign up for it. And so we need to have a better term for this. And then as I mentioned, then you say performance marketing. And when you say performance marketing, it leads people to create terrible marketing. It leads to terrible SEO posts just to drive organic search volume. It leads to people, saying sign up for a demo immediately when they're not even aware of who you are. It leads to calling too much. When you say performance marketing and take the brand out of it, it leads to bad brand experiences. So we can't have this brand marketing versus performance marketing paradigm anymore. It's no good. So what's the alternative? I really prefer the terms mental availability and physical availability. If you've read anything from like the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and others, you'll hear these terms, but I think they're much more powerful in describing what needs to happen. Mental availability is the idea that people are aware of your brand, but as importantly, they're aware of your brand when they go make a purchase decision. You're in their consideration set and you're trying to build this mental availability. It's not just the idea that people are just know your brand or remember your brand. It's that when they go to make a purchase, you're in that consideration set. And that's what mental availability is. And that's what you're trying to build. And so you go to the CEO and say, hey, I'm trying to make people aware of our brand. Well, that's fine, but I'm not that jazzed about it. But you go and say, hey, when people go to make a purchase, we want them to consider our brand. That's much more powerful. An alternative to performance marketing is this physical availability, which is how easy is it to find and buy your brand. So when people are actually making their purchase, you want to make that process as easy as possible. And that's what physical availability is. It's much more than just performance marketing. It's about making it easy to actually select and buy your brand. So, as an alternative, instead of saying brand marketing, which is meaningless, it diminishes the importance of brand. It doesn't talk about performance at all. It puts it in way too narrow a box. No one's going to sign up for just brand awareness. Or performance marketing, which again diminishes the importance of brand and doesn't really talk about what it's trying to accomplish. Let's use the terms mental and physical availability in terms of what we're trying to accomplish from a marketing perspective. They're much more accurate in terms of what we're trying to do. So, what's a huge factor keeping companies from switching? How expensive and painful it is to switch. So, what do we do about it? Jason Lemkin talks about this. He says it's a lot of work to switch vendors, a total pain. So, be very embarrassed when you lose an existing customer to the competition and really find out why. No one wants to switch if they don't need to, and to do something about it before it happens again. I think it's a great point. Obviously, you want to know why people are thinking about leaving you. But on the flip side, if you're a company, especially a challenger brand, you want to make it as easy as possible for people to switch. This is a huge factor in the decision on whether to switch or not. I mean, that's why Jason wrote this post, because it's painful to switch. So, what can you do to make it as easy as possible? How can you make it as part of your brand that switching is easy? And this involves a strategic approach. It's not just messaging saying, hey, it's easy to switch to our company. No, it requires a strategy. It's thinking about what your offer is. Can you create an offer that accounts for the fact that people are going to have to potentially get out of contracts? Can you do something where it doesn't need to be a rip and replace of whoever's in place, but you can run alongside them so they can have both products. So you have an offer that's affordable enough that allows them to do both. Can you set up your technology in a way that makes it very simple to actually switch to your product? Is your customer success team set up to enable people to switch easily? Is your training in place? All these things are so important, but like I said, it's not just like something you cross off the list. You need a strategic approach to making switching as simple as possible. And because as Jason said, it's very painful to switch. So when people are making their decision, this is a huge factor on whether they're actually going to change vendors or not. So make that easy for them. It's painful, make it easy for them. And like I said, it requires an investment. It requires a strategy to make switching as easy as possible. But if you solve that, it makes it much more likely people. 3 points related to growth today. 1, if you're a PE investor, make sure you think about the organization as part of your investment thesis. It's one thing to see a big opportunity, but it's another thing to make it happen. And it is driven through leadership, culture, and capability. So make sure you take a look at those as part of the due diligence process. 2, it's time to retire the term brand marketing. It puts brand in way too narrow a box. It doesn't attribute any performance to brand, and it's a tough sell. You can't just say, hey, I'm trying to build brand awareness. Let's look at mental availability and physical availability as alternatives because they're much more descriptive of what we're trying to accomplish. And then 3, make it as easy as possible for companies to switch to your product. It's a big factor on whether companies are going to move or not. And so you need to have a strategic approach to making switching easy.